Hi, good afternoon, everyone, again. Let us get on the way with this IGDS Lunchtime Seminar. As you know, IGDS has had a long history of hosting these lunchtime seminars, and today it is our pleasure to have Miss Valerie Charles with us to speak about the way in which faith-based organizations are experiencing the NPO registration and the other ensuing protocols around that bit of legislation. So Valerie said something very interesting about the act. She said, like like the pandemic, the NPO registration and more so the FIU regulations have plunged FBOs into a state of a new normal. So we're going to ask, you might be asking, who is Valerie? Valerie Charles is the holder of an MSc in Marketing Management from Nottingham Trent University and a postgraduate qualification in marketing from the Chartered Institute of Marketing. Miss Charles' career has allowed her to pursue her passions spanning education, advertising, marketing, tourism, and consultancy. She has lectured at both the UWI and the West Indies School of Theology in the areas of marketing and communications. Apart from her experience in education and training, Ms. Charles has spent over a decade leading creative teams in the advertising industry throughout the Caribbean. As an independent marketing and research consultant, she has earned a solid reputation developing marketing programs to help small and medium-sized local businesses build their brands. Alongside her consultancy business, she serves the Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies as the National Administrator and Strategic Advisor to the General Executive. Ms. Valerie Charles, I'm handing over to you now. Thank you for being with us.
So I want to give a little bit of PAWI. Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies was established in 1910, and this organization is a religious organization. It's operating in 7 Caribbean countries, including Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, the organization comprises 120 churches, a theological institution with a main campus and 2 branches. We have 5 district offices. We have a missionary agency and emergency response agency. So today I'm dealing with my presentation will be coming from 2 angles. In the first instance, we'll be talking about the registration process and specifically our experience. And then we'll be looking at compliance with existing regulation and how it is likely to impact not just our organization, but of course, other FBOs. And so to talk a little bit about the process, we started the process for us, and that is the NPO registration. That would have started for us in January 2020. When we set out to do these registration, our intent initially was to bulk register or to have all of our 120 churches registered at the same time. Of course, when we attempted to do that, we were told that could not have happened. So we had to have each church individually registered. Following that, our plan was intentional. And so what we did was we decided to register one church and use that one church as a model. And following the successful, what we thought would have been a successful registration, we then use it as a template to register the other 119 churches, and of course, the 5 districts and all the other entities that make up PAWI, Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies. So let me tell you a little bit of the outcome of the first registration. So I personally did that, went down to RGD department, went with this one registration, And I was told, but my initial feeling at that time that the persons were not aware, they were not familiar with the registration process. In fact, I was told that the church had to be incorporated. And so the search had to be done. So the normal thing. So a search had to be done, and incorporation had to be done. But I had in my hands documents which informed us that, of course, we could have registered as an unincorporated entity. Was about to leave, and then I just turned back and I went back to inquiry and asked, who else can I talk to? And someone directed me to legal department. I went up to legal department, had a conversation. They seemed to be a little amazed that the other departments weren't aware of the registration and the process. With some minor amendments to my registration, I was able to get it done, and in fact was able to receive the certificate in 5 days. And so that was good. And so what happened next? So using that model, we went on to have seminars with all of our leaders and our churches. We gave instruction how this is to be done. What I did following that was actually a model application form. So the application at that point, you have to fill out two forms. And the first is the Register General form, which is a single page. And there is a 5-page document, which is the FIU form to be filled out. So I actually did a sample form, gave it to all of the churches and said, this is what you're going to do. Further to that, I actually developed a package. So each church had a package. And so the intent was, you just follow this model and you're going to be all right. And so, yes, we did that. From that point, we established a policy of information sharing, and I think it worked well for us. And the intent of this is that when you go to the register department, if you had any experience that was outside of what we gave to you, come share it with us, and we share it with the other churches. And so we did. But what happened? For the first 6 months of the process, and as I said, we started in 2020, so that would have included the pandemic period. And so that was a very difficult time for registration. Not only we now had to make, so prior to the pandemic, you could just walk in and have your registration done. But what happened, you now had to make an appointment, and that was a very difficult process. The employees were on rotation. You'd call 1,000 times before you can get through. So there was a little difficult time in actually getting the appointment made. But more than that, the requirements for each person that went in, each church that went in, the requirement appeared to be different from what I experienced and different from what other persons would have experienced. In fact, one church was turned away 4 times. And that is because every time they corrected the form and they went back into the office, they would encounter a different person, and that person would have some different requirement that was not made, provisions for that was not made before. And this was a very difficult time. Um, what followed was, and this worked well, finally, what followed is that the Register General Department decided that before you come in, you fill out your form, you send it in, we will vet the form. When we think that you have met all the requirements, then you actually come into the office. So that worked well, and it helped to move the process along a little faster. Of course, we had other issues with identification, the use of the national ID versus the driver's permit and so on, but we were able to overcome that. And at the end of the day, since then, we were able to register 119 of our 120 churches. All 5 districts were registered. The missionary agency is registered. The emergency response center is registered. And the theological institution is also registered. For the most part, most of these institutions would have received their registration certificate. So the next arm of the process would be compliance with the existing FIU regulations. And so let me give you a sense of how we operate as an organization. So I mentioned 120 churches. All of our churches are headed by a pastor and is managed by him or her along with a board of directors. All of our churches, we have treasurers or accountants and a secretary. Depending on the size of the congregation, the amount of employees, and when I speak about employees, I'm talking about paid positions, they may vary from 1 person to 15, in some cases, maybe a little more. So for the most part, the positions that are held at churches are voluntary positions. And except for the pastor, and if there's a full-time secretary or an administrator, those would be paid positions. But for the most part, the boards function free. Most of the other departments or the functional areas are people who volunteer their service to the church. All churches have direct report to the districts, as I mentioned before. Our organization, the structure in Trinidad would be 5 districts. And so within the districts, you have churches that fall within the districts, and those churches report to the district, and the districts report to the National Council where I am. And the primary income of churches, of course, is derived from donations given by members. So those entities that fall under the FIU supervision, who are those entities? So those are the entities with the annual income. So churches with annual income or districts with annual income over 500,000. Now the determination for the FIU supervision is based, when you look at the form, the criteria, it's based only on the entity's previous income year. So if and in a few cases, there may be something that is unusual or temporary situation. So let's say a church is raising funds, and so you had an unusual income coming in, and it may have been, it just so happened to be the year prior. It means that that church would now fall under the supervision of the FIU, because for that income year, your records would have shown that you would have earned in excess, or receive, let me use the word receive, in excess of $500,000. So there are those unusual situations, and I chose to call them temporary because they are not the usual experiences of the church over a number of years. So you may have one situation cause plunging a church into that situation of being under the supervision of the FIU. And so what I want to look at is 3 basic areas: the impact of the FIU regulations. And so there's a financial impact, there's a cultural impact, and I also want to speak to the spiritual impact of the regulations. Let's talk a little bit of financial impact. So I am pulling from the financial obligation regulation, and I'm looking specifically in this case at 3 and 4. And one requirement speaks to retaining the services of a compliance officer and an alternate compliance officer. Now, these are 2 professionals. And so what it says, every supervised entity, non-regulated financial institution, and listed businesses, and we FBOs fall under what is called listed businesses, must appoint a compliance officer and an alternate compliance officer. And so what is the implication for, now remember, I just said earlier on that in terms of the staffing of these churches, they may vary from 1 employee to 15, and in some case, maybe just a little more based on the size of the congregation. And the regulation is asking for the engagement of the services of a compliance officer and an alternate compliance officer. And so let me tell you a little bit about who this person is, who they're asking for. So the appointment of the employee, there must be a well-trained, and this is coming from the regulation, must be a well-trained person suitable to perform the task. Additionally, the CEO and the ACO must have decision-making authority. For listed businesses, which we are, the designated CEO can be a senior employee of the business or competent professionals with qualifications in law, in accountancy, in business management, or in relevant qualification and sound knowledge and so on. The CEO and the ACO must be approved. And so we have this other factor here, that the both of them must be approved by the FIU. And so the church doesn't have the singular authority to determine, so you can present a person to the FIU and say, this person, we want this person to be our compliance officer. But it requires the approval of the FIU. And so let me remind us here that, as I said before, some of these churches may not have the professional staff to undertake that responsibility. With in most cases, we have the pastors who are overall responsible for the churches. They are like the CEOs, and they're responsible for the management of the churches. And so in this case, we are looking for someone outside with the responsibility, and the law says specifically that that person reports to the FIU. So if the compliance officer suspects that there is something that is contrary happening internally, that person's responsibility is to report that matter directly. In fact, the law says that that is the only person that can report to the FIU. And so it creates some problem, because a lot of the churches, the existing structure does not provide for such professional staff in some cases. And so it means that the church would have to go outside of the boundaries of the church to get that person to fill that position. The other issue here is there is a requirement of monitoring international and local lists. Now, we've been looking at this, and this is, even though it may appear to be something that is easy, it's a very difficult undertaking. So what the legislation is asking, that we monitor international and local lists to determine whether members or donors' names are on those lists. And so we have the UN security, this first one, this list. And this is, of course, the names of person will be carrying in this list whose names are flagged and determined to be either involved in money laundering or financing of terrorism. We also have the Trinidad and Tobago consolidated list of court orders. And of course, when we talk about open source newspaper and media and so on. So there is a requirement that we must now look on these lists. And so it's a costly undertaking, because we attempted to implement the first one, and that first list, the UN Security Council list, the cost for doing so for the subscription is $5,100 US per user. In addition to that, what we'd encounter is that the implementation of this particular requirement will also require us to have more staff within the churches. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that a lot of the persons who are working in the church, their services are voluntary. Of course, some of the church don't have the capacity to do it. They don't have the financing to do it. And beside that, it's very labor intensive. It's labor intensive because it means that if a new member comes into the church, because that person, if you're a member, you automatically become a donor. And what happens is that we would now have for existing members, so we'd have to go back and look at existing members, and we'll also have to go back and search for these names of persons who are coming in as new members, search these lists to determine whether these persons are, their names are flagged for anything that is illegal. That is very, very difficult for many of our churches, and when we take the cost factor into consideration, almost prohibitive. We also have, when we talk about we have also other requirements. We talk about the due diligence. There's a need for looking at right, the compliance program. Now, this is a major part. The compliance program is a major part of the responsibility of an organization or entity that falls under the supervision of the FIU. What does that require? It requires, it's actually require a lot of technical skills. And you'd see some of the things, the requirements here, customer due diligence, identification of internal reporting. So we, that program requires the church to put in place a program where you can monitor suspicious activity. It needs to put in place development of a threshold for payment. So we're talking about source of funds. You would be, most of you will be familiar when you go to the banks, that you'd have, if you bring some sum of money that is above the bank's threshold, you'd be required to fill out a source of fund document and so on. Now, this is the easy part. But in terms of management and retention of the transaction, determining a major part of this is risk assessment. So the compliance program, for the most part, requires churches to determine the risk that the church is likely to face. They need to develop programs how to mitigate. In fact, you need to assess the risk. Is it a high? The likelihood is high, low, or medium. You need to determine how it's going to impact the organization. And of course, you need to develop strategies on how to mitigate against those risks. You need to also to identify the level organization structure. So one of the things we'd have to do is to review the organization structure. Where are we going to place the CEO and the ACO? The law tells us they must be in a position where they can make a decision making. So all of that, how we monitor, publish the list that I referred to earlier. And so all of that forms part of your compliance program. Now, we understand that for each church, depending on the risk that is anticipated, the compliance program may vary. Nonetheless, each church must develop, once you fall under the FIU, you must develop your compliance program. And so I'm saying that a financial implication for the churches is that you would need to get to have the resources of technical staff, because this whole process is something that is very technical in terms of risk assessment and so on. And so this is additional staff and of course additional expenditure for churches. So I don't know why my all right, so we look at the financial aspect, and we have the issue of the cultural aspect. And I want to speak to the legislation relating to the source of funds, and I alluded to it earlier on. So okay, so before I get there, let me talk a little bit about the financial audit. And again, this is an implication, a financial implication on churches. There are two audits that are required, one, an internal audit and an external audit. And so the entity will be required to have someone do an internal audit. And basically what this is, it is to ensure that the church is compliant with the program that they have set in writing. And the FIU will also be doing, and that is the external audit. The FIU will also be doing an audit. And again, what we are looking for, compliance, how close the church remains with its compliance program to ensure the implementation and effectiveness of the internal controls, reporting obligations, and so on. They are going to be looking at the operations of the church and see how it matches with the compliance document. And so I want to look at the second thing, is the cultural impact. So there is a part of the regulation that speaks to, and the financial obligation regulation, and that is 15, and it speaks to due diligence and knowing your members. And I'll just have extrapolated a little bit of it. And what is the requirement? The completion of a very detailed membership application. So one of the requirement is that we now have to ensure that each church, there's a very detailed membership form that members must now fill out. Now, this is not just for persons who are coming into the system or new persons coming into the church, but if you have been there before, you would now have to fill out this form, because some of our churches, they do have membership application. And I can tell you that the membership application that is now used, it is not compliant. What I mean is that it doesn't have all of the requirements that is now required by the FIU. There is an additional requirement for example, for persons who serve on church boards. I want to go back and stress that those persons, their services are voluntary. And so for persons who serve on the church board, they have the additional requirement of obtaining a police record of good character. Now, I'll tell you something. Since this has been introduced to the churches, we have a number of persons who would have resigned from church boards. We have some folks that are retired. We have some other younger folks. They have responsibilities on their job and so on, and they just don't want to be bothered with this additional requirement. So what are the implications for us, right? Generally, people are unwilling to divulge some of their personal information. So I will tell you, that form requires almost everything, name, address. It requires salary range. It requires information on your employment and so on. And for the most part, we find members finds the requirement is very intrusive. And in fact, there are some persons who are unwilling to complete the forms. And as I said, because most board members, they serve voluntarily, a lot of, not a lot, but a few have withdrawn from service, and there's a couple more who are considering it. People are generally concerned, again, also about the protection of their personal information. So let's just think about a church you have been a member of for 20 years. You've never filled out a membership application form. You're considered to be a member. But now you're being asked by this church to fill out this 2-page application form, because it requires so much details. People become very suspicious. People are very concerned about what will happen with the information they are providing, and how will this information be protected. In some cases, we have to continuously implement some educational programs and keep saying this is a requirement by the law and we have to do it, because in some cases the information is attributed to the church, or the church just want to find a little more about us. And so it's a difficult journey for us, because this is it's something new. A lot of churches are not used to it. A lot of members are not used to divulging such detailed information, and it has been rolled out in the majority of our churches. We are getting some feedback. People, the apprehensions that are coming out, it's very concerning for us. Of course, we also have the issue of the politically exposed. Again, Regulation 20 of the Financial Obligation Regulation 2010, it's required, and this came out from the regulation: a financial institution or listed business shall put appropriate measures in place to determine whether an applicant for business or account or beneficial owner is a politically exposed person. Here's the difficulty. When information is being sourced, now we are talking about the application form. So part of the application form, we have asked in the membership application form, we have given the definition and the description of a politically exposed person, and we have asked, so if you fit that criteria, then there is another form that you have to fill out. And so the question is, if persons don't divulge, because in some of these cases you would not know, if person are unwilling to divulge such information, what is the church supposed to do? And we look also at the nature and the role of the church, because the church has now to take on an investigative role, because here's a law saying that the listed business, they shall put appropriate measure in place to determine whether, what are those measures. We'd have to investigate persons when they come in. What is the background of those persons, where are they coming from, and so on. So this is additional function that is not untraditional as far as the church is concerned. And I finally want to look at the spiritual impact. And I mentioned earlier the issue of the source of funds. And this is very important for religious organization. And so the requirement, members need to declare the activity, event, business occupation, or employment generating the funds they are donating to the church. Now, prior to this happening, one of the requirements, and I would have mentioned it earlier on, one of the requirements of the legislation is that the church each entity needs to determine a threshold for the receipt of funds. And what I'm saying here is that the church will determine what amount of money, what is the threshold we will set, and what amount of monies persons would donate to the church or give to the church without having to fill out a source of funds form. In some cases, we started, and I'll talk a little bit about standardization a little later on, but what we would have done is try for our organization to set a threshold. And it's difficult because it varies from church to church, from congregation to congregation. So you have some persons who are big givers, you have smaller givers, and we have now to determine what's a middle ground that we can set. Of course, we do not want to put our members in a position where if they are given every month, they need to fill out this source of fund document every month. And I think that is going to be very discouraging for them. Now, for the most part, giving is a private matter, and I'm talking about the spiritual impact. Giving is a private matter. And of course, the concept is drawn from the Bible, and I've given a quotation, Matthew 3 and 4. And what it says, that the right hand should not know what the left hand is doing. When that is translated literally, it means that if you are giving, then your giving is something that is private and not necessarily to be told to others, the amount and so on. Now, the implication of the legislation, one of the things we have to look at is the Christian community. For the Christian community, giving is an act of worship to God. And so it is seen as something that is sacred. It is seen as something that is personal. I don't need to tell you how much I'm giving. And so when we talk about source of funds, it means that people will now have to not just write their names and provide information. We do have envelopes in churches, but people are free. As it stands now, some people would put their gifts in the envelope, and some people put their names on it. Some people just don't bother to put their names because they hold strictly to the concept of not letting your right hand know what your left hand is doing. And so so as I said, for the Christian community, giving is an act of worship. And so when we have legislation that appears to be going contrary to that, it is cause for a bit of concern. So they see giving as something sacred, they see it as personal, and for many persons, the legislation makes it a little difficult for persons to balance their desire to give or to engage in this act of worship and to remain anonymous. And so what the act is saying to us now, where the legislation is concerned, we have to be accountable beyond the source of funds, churches, the churches are required to say where the income is coming from. And so you could have in the past make a general statement or give a general figure and say this amount came from giving, this amount came from whatever. But now you have to be specific, more specific about the source of the funds. Now, the other implications. So members will now have to, as we say, complete the source of fund form if the donation is over the threshold that is set by the church. It is difficult, and this is one of the issues we have. It is difficult for a church to monitor giving. It is not done. If you're going to the bank, it is easy for a bank to implement source of funds, because if you go with a check to deposit in your account, at that point, the bank can say, let me see your ID, and you fill out this source of fund. Offerings and collections in church are done differently. So if you, all of you may have been in a church before, a basket is passed around, people put their offerings in. Now, it's very difficult to monitor what is given. It is difficult to monitor who has given. And so only after the fact, when the accountant or the treasurer is tabulating what has been collected, then at that point, you will have to determine if someone has placed funds in there that is over the threshold. If the person has left the church, if the person just came in and dropped and left, in fact, the counting of these funds are not done during the services, they're done after. So in any event, you only discover what is given after the service is over. And so how do you contact those persons who have given if they have not left an address? If they have not left information. Yes, we put some things in place, and we continue to make announcements and say to people, don't forget you have to fill out your form. If you're giving more than the threshold, over the threshold, you'd have to, but there are visitors that may come in and give. What do you do? So it's something that is very difficult to manage. Because you don't have, and this is when we talk about risk, the risk assessment. These are some of the things that we have to treat with in the risk assessment. What is the risk of persons coming in and dropping money and you can't determine who they are? How do you mitigate against that? And so some of the measures we have taken, given all that I have said, some of the measures that we have taken as an organization. Now, I want to reiterate that, remember, while we have 120 churches, each church operates as far, and not all of them are under FIU supervision, but each church that is under FIU supervision, each entity must establish their own way of being compliant with the regulations. And what we have done to help, because as I said, it is new, this whole legislation has plunged us into some new norms. And so what we have done as the National Council, we have attempted to standardize some of the approaches so that we can help our churches go through this process. And what do I mean by that? So we have developed new membership application forms, standardized forms across, so all of our 120 churches would be using the same forms. We have standardized some of our policies, because a big part of this would be our accounting, the accountability as far as the finances are concerned. So what we have also done, we have asked our churches to migrate from one accounting platform to another accounting platform, so we can have some kind of seamless way that our accounting is done. So we have church, and it may be a little expensive for some who are already operating, but we have asked churches as of to go back to 2019 and 2020 and migrate their accounts, so we all use a standardized approach. What we are also doing is providing we have ongoing training for our churches as far as the development of these compliance policies. Remember, we talk about this being in some cases very technical requirements, and the truth is that some of our churches, we do not have the manpower, we do not have the skill sets in there to be able to handle those, but yet we have to meet the requirements. And so what we are doing is training our churches, training our pastors, training our members in terms of how do we develop. So we would have some skills in-house. How do we develop our compliance policy? And so both the standardization and the training is helping us to get through this process. And so, and I want to conclude by sharing our position. And so while I have identified some of the struggles that we are having with the legislation, we really believe that the laws are needed. We understand the reason for the implementation, and any approach or any attempt to address money laundering and terrorist financing, our organization would be ready to be compliant and assist. In many respects, the legislation will go a long way in helping FBOs, not just us, but all FBOs and other entities to adopt best practices. Because in fact, that's how we see it. We really see the legislation as best practices. And in fact, we maybe be the first organization to say it has helped us and it is helping us. And we find that while, as we said, it is new to our organization, we are struggling, uh, we find that our leadership and our pastors are very inclined to be compliant. The other thing is that there are clear indications from the legislation that it can help us to preserve the integrity of our operations. And, there's always this question mark over churches and money and so on. And this is certainly, the legislation is certainly helping us to preserve the integrity. However, we view the legislation as a one size fit all. And clearly some parts of the legislation not fitting us at all. What I would have done is just pull out a few of those, the ones that impact us greatly. I would have pulled out a few, but when you look at the legislation, it doesn't in all instances take into consideration the uniqueness of FBOs. And so they in many cases, so things that are applicable to the financial services sector and will work well for them, it does not work for us. It doesn't work for us. Um, some aspects of the legislation, it has the potential of affecting the viability of FBOs, especially in relation to giving. As I said, people, giving is something that is so private and so on. And when people feel that they have to, and I'm not talking only about our membership. We receive support external to our churches. And so if we have to go to those who support us and say you have to fill out a source of fund, or that kind of thing, people are going to be less willing to support us. We understand internally, I mentioned giving for members of the church is an act of worship, and so our members may be more inclined to continue giving. However, the support we get external to our membership, external to our churches, we can see that drying up if we impose these additional this legislation. In a major aspect of the function of the church is our social responsibility. And of course, if giving is impacted, then our social responsibility in some way that will be impacted as well. We see a need for the FBOs to lobby the government. And I'm speaking specifically, I'm saying that because we view the legislation as being a one size fit all, there is a need for the government to review this legislation and be a little more sensitive, because some of those requirements, I spoke to the source of funds. I spoke to, because it's difficult managing some of these requirements in the context of the church. It is difficult managing it in the context of our resources. And when I talk about resources, I'm talking about both of our financial and our human resources. We are not structured. We don't have that kind of internal structure that allow us the latitude to do some of the things that the legislation is asking us to do. As I said, it is labor intensive in some instances. And as I said, some churches may have one employee, some have two employees, and definitely will not be able to respond positively to some of the requirements of the legislation. I think that's the end. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Miss Charles. If we were in the IGDS, we'd give you a IGDS seminar room round of applause. Thank you so much for taking the time. We do have some questions, and I would just like to remind everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. It will be really good if we can see your questions. So I have a few questions. I'll group them. Is that okay with you, Ms.
Yes,
Charles? Yes,
yes,
I'll group
yeah.
them, and then we will things. I'll give you three. The first question, Candice, I see you. The first question is, who are eligible to be members of boards? What are the criteria, role, and function? There's that one. Hold on for the other one. How and when does the FIU become fully involved? This is Michelle. She asked, is it when the church has funds over a specific amount?
So the first one is, who are members of the board?
Yeah, who are eligible to be members of the board? The second one is, how and when does the FIU become involved? Is it when the church has funds over a specific amount? Take those two now, please. And ask
Okay.
Michelle and Candice.
Okay, so in response to the first, really the constitution and bylaws of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies allows for the church to elect its board. It allows for the pastor to appoint a board. So we have two conditions. So in the first instance, we have the church can elect the board. and we have a pastor that can appoint a board. But once the pastor appoints, then the church must validate the appointment. So the church can appoint, the church can have an election, and they can elect, no, let me use the right words. So the church can elect a board. The pastor can appoint. If the pastor appoints, the church validates. But the church has the right to elect those they want to serve on the board. And so for different churches, it may work a little differently. So in some churches, the church may have an election and elect board members. I want to believe that in most cases, the appointment, the boards are appointed and not elected, because when the board is appointed, it means that you have someone who is looking at the skill sets of those persons who are coming on to serve, um, and having that balance of persons on the board serving who is able to help in terms of the management of the management of the church. Question 2, how and when the FIU comes involved. Okay, so when you submit, I mentioned earlier on, the application process requires the applicant to fill out 2 forms. So you fill out one form that goes to the Registrar General Department, and the second form, both of them go to the Registrar General, and the Registrar General in turn sends the FIU application directly to the FIU. So they just check, make sure you answer all the questions and so on, and they send that off to the FIU. Once the income, and I mentioned it earlier on, once the previous year's income is over 500,000, you are automatically under the supervision of the FIU. And so that application goes to the FIU. Once the FIU gets it, they write you a letter. They will write the entity a letter saying you are now under the supervision of the FIU. But the sole criteria is that annual income. And as I said, it speaks to the income of the previous year. So if you had something unusual happening, so it could be a small church, a very small church. But and I'll give you an example. We ever had a couple of churches that fell into that bracket. So they are doing a building fund, and they are raising fund for something, and other churches and districts are supporting them. So they would have collected a substantial amount of money that would have led their income to appear as if. And once it fell in that income year, you are now seen as a church that is earning over $500,000, and you are now under the supervision of the FIU. The question is whether that is a sufficient criteria for supervision, but that's how you get under FIU supervision.
Okay. Two more questions. One, can the compliance person be outsourced? And take this one for me. It's coming from Kathy. Hello, Kathy. Thanks for joining us. Do churches and NPOs in developed countries have to comply with similar regulations?
So first question, if the service can be outsourced, absolutely. Yes, it can be. It can be. Um, the challenge, as again, I say there's a financial implication because this is a professional. Yeah, this is a professional. So 2 things let me mention here. Yes, they can be outsourced, but the person must be approved. Listen, there is a very extensive process that takes place in this approval. This person is actually investigated. So the persons whose name you are submitting as your compliance officer. And so we have in our churches, we have excellent persons that we feel can be good compliance officers, but that is not up to us. So you submit a resume and so on, but the FIU undertakes an investigation, and they determine. So they must approve the person. So yes, the person can be outsourced, but they must be approved by the FIU.
Oh, Val, you want to finish?
Yeah,
Sorry.
and so the other one, I'm not aware. I'm not aware
Hmm.
whether other countries, what are the requirements?
Okay. So I have another, and it says uh, contributions that are received over a specific amount and where a source of funds is not available. How does the legislation treat with that? And also, thanks, Candice, has PAWI amended their constitution and bylaws to meet the requirements of the FIU? Candice again. Candice, I see you plenty. Talk to me.
Okay,
Welcome.
okay, so let me answer. We realize that there are some amendments that are required. The the amendment of the bylaws and constitution is not a simple thing. The next time the general executive meets is in 2022. That can only be done. Yes. So that was supposed to happen in 2020 because of the pandemic. Um, because of the pandemic, we had to put it off. And so the next time it happens, and certainly there are a list of things on there for constitutional review, and this certainly would be one of them.
Hmm. Okay, Christy, I hear you and I see you. Christy is asking, Val, what
Mhm.
legislation applies to faith-based organizations? She thanks Christy for clarifying. She's saying, for instance, the appointment of a compliance officer. What is that legislation? You wanna?
It's it's let me go back to, can I just let me
Let
just
me. You want right?
so the financial obligation regulation. Now, the financial obligation regulation, where anywhere in that legislation where you see listed business, it refers to any business other than the financial. So you'd see in it's stated, the way it is stated in the legislation, financial institution and listed business. So FBOs fall under that category that is called listed business. So anywhere in that legislation, you see the term listed business, they are speaking to us.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? I'm seeing, I'm actually allowing persons to come off their mic now and share with us any questions, any concerns, any comments, because I think Ms. Shazov, has given us a lot to think about. For me, Val, I would love if you can just that $5,100
US.
US access. Could you just revisit that for me in terms of what does that speak to?
So, okay, so remember we are required to check these lists to determine whether persons that are coming in and I am making the connection between membership and donors because you can't separate them. So once a person becomes a member of of a church, they automatically become a donor. And so what the legislation is saying is that before we embrace such persons now, because we are going to be receiving money from them, we need to check there. So they give us three lists. And I was looking at the one at the top, which is the United Nations list. And it's in a format where, so there are two issues. One is that there is an online list that you can access, but that is not regularly updated. And so we also have that question, how often do we have to check this list? So a good person may come in church, let's just for conversation, somebody, a decent person may come in church and they decide to go astray. How often should we check to see if persons whose name, who were not on the list previously, if they are on the list now? How often? So we don't have that kind of guidance, but we are told that we need to check the list to ensure that those persons, they are persons whose names are flagged because they are involved in, and in some cases their accounts were frozen and all of those things. So their names are flagged in these lists. And because remember, if we find one of them in one of our congregation, the compliance officer must now report that person to the FIU. Yeah. And if they're giving money, because no, where they getting the money to give, those kinds of things. And so the list helps us. The list is a compilation of those persons who are red flagged because they are in breach of one of some aspect of the law. Either they are suspected to be involved in money laundering or financing of terrorism.
Thanks, Val. Now, I would just like to highlight the fact that Ms. Charles is the second presenter on the FIU. In February, we had former FIU employee, Senator Lakshmi Dial, on the content of the law. And if you wish to look at the different presentations on the FIU, it will be on the IGDS website. But thanks, Kathy, for telling us. We will, in fact, approach the FIU around these questions, because this is a series that we really would like to engage in terms of advocating for some middle ground in terms of how we move forward, not only for our faith-based partners, but our civil society partners. So I see Nicole's hand is up for a long, long time. So Nicole, you want to ask a question?
Sure. Afternoon, everybody. Is there
Hi.
any guidance to any new entity that may be coming on and maybe thinking about registration in terms of how you may guide them through that process?
I have to give some credit to the Register General's Department because they have come a long way. We are a year and something into the process. The process is much simpler. They have provided, there are a list of documents that you must provide. As I said earlier, they have provided an avenue. Now, we because we were first, our organization, a number of our churches were first in line, we experienced the back and forth. They have now introduced, as I said, where you can send your application in. They vet your application, so you don't need to be in there 3 times and 4 times and being told different things by different person. So the process is much easier. You must have your records. If your finances are not up to date and so on, you will have a little difficult time because you'd need to provide information. You must also have the willingness. I'll tell you something. When this process started, the board members. So when I registered the first entity, only one person's name was on it, and I had no problem. It went through easy. When the other persons went in, they are now saying to you, all of your board members, the names of your board members must now be on this form. And so one of the things I would advise, you'd need to get the consent of your board members, whether they want to be part of this process. Because some people I don't want my name, that kind of thing. I don't want my name in anything with the government. And so we must get the agreement of board members. We want members that are willing to be part of the process because they also have to sign the form. They are co-controllers. So the persons are called their controllers, and they have equal responsibilities where compliance is concerned. Equal responsibility. The other thing I'd say to you, I know the deadline. The deadline has shifted several times. The new deadline now is, I think, is June. I think the government's serious about if you're not registered on time, I think is 7 years in jail and $50,000. I don't know. We don't want organizations to be operating outside of those regulations. So if you're going to operate, ensure that you get in there, get your registration done in time. The process is much easier, and let's be compliant.
Okay, it's interesting. Ms. Charles, you're saying the same thing. Senator Lakshmi Dial said, let's be compliant with writing us. Ms. Charles, we still with you, We have another question. I should say, Candice, how are FBOs going about raising the issue with the government, their challenges of this legislation? Now, Michelle could only speak for Power, yeah? So, so she's not speaking for FBOs in general. Talk to us.
We initially thought that our organization would address our concerns as far as the legislation is concerned and write a letter to the Attorney General. That was our initial thinking. But we pulled back a little bit, and we understand there is strength in numbers. And so what we are doing is lobbying our colleagues in other faith-based organizations, because we feel in that way the collective approach would have much more impact if anything has to be done. I'll tell you though, we have said to our churches, I learned a phrase many years ago: comply and then complain. So we are complying. Let me hasten to say here as well that we have even encouraged churches that are not falling under FIU supervision. We are encouraging our churches to adopt some of the same policies, some of the same requirements of the legislation, because it is good practice. It is best practice. And so it doesn't, not because we don't fall under FIU compliance. And this is what when we treat with our churches, we are treated with our churches as a whole. We are saying to everyone, there are some really good aspects of the legislation. Please comply. Even if you don't fall under the regulation, it's good for us. It's good for the reputation of our churches. Yeah. And so we continue to encourage them adopt some of these principles. And so as I said earlier on, we are standardizing some of our things, and we are helping them to adopt some of these measures so that we will operate with some level of credibility.
Okay. I'm saying thanks so much, Miss Charles. You make me happy. I'm seeing Kathy Shepherd from Kaiso. Thanks, Kathy. Kathy is saying she has to leave, but she's very grateful for the information, the illuminating presentation, and for your generosity of sharing. Yeah, so she's saying it's very useful information. Is there anyone who would like to come off their mic? I mean, I am hastening to close. I know time is of the essence, but is there anyone who would like to? I'm opening up 2 questions off the mic. Please, anyone? And I have a thank you again from Church of Christ in Canopia to everyone. Thank you for the information. It's useful. And I have our MSc student, Ms. Candice Arthur Frederick, also saying thank you so very much for this information. We really recognize as members of the IGDS that this is something that it is a question of inclusion. How do smaller, whether it's organizations, whether it's faith-based or community-based or civil society organization, how do they get into a space where they can effectively comply? Val, you want to reflect a bit on the way in which size matters in this situation?
I think one of the things that is working for us, as I said, is standardization. And so from a central office, our national office, we do understand. I'll tell you, in some of these cases, some of those churches, when they were doing their application forms, I say, let me see it before you take it in. Let me help you. Let me vet your forms. And so you really need to walk people through the process. And I'll tell you, because it's something that is new, it requires some more effort. It requires some more encouragement throughout the first registration process. I'd have to say to people, when they call to complain, I'd say to people, I'd say, listen to me, they're learning and we're learning. because you could tell. When I went in with my first registration, the person who did it at the register, she said to me, "This is the first time I'm doing this, you know." And so we understand that the process is going to be a little difficult because we are unfamiliar with it. They are unfamiliar with it. They are sometimes, and so we were really very patient in spite of the many times we had to go and fix this and tell us change the same thing 10 times. But we understood the purpose of doing it. And we also understood, because it is new, that it's going to take some time for us to get used to it. And so it really requires us holding the hands of the smaller entities, being there, helping them through the process. We have had, there are times I actually literally went to the Register General with them. You know, it requires, because it's also new. Think about a church, and I'd use us as an example. Think about a church who, you have a pastor who has been there for 50 years. This is something absolutely new to him. He is scared. He is very concerned. Where's this taking us? What's the end result? What does it mean? Does it mean that, because we are not used to that? And so it really requires a lot of effort. It requires the training. One of the things we have been able to do successfully, we have had a lot of online training. And as I said, shared information. When someone has had an experience, they share it with us. We had these bulletins going out. Almost every 2 days, we had a bulletin going out. This is what is happening. So people are, aware of what is happening. They learn to appreciate the process and understand, and we continue to say, this is going to work for us. This is going to help us. Because for us, big picture is this: compliance helps the integrity of our organization. And that is a huge thing for us. The compliance and lining up that with the integrity of our organization.
Okay, great. I would stop here because I think that those are some really excellent closing words, which Ms. Charles have shared with us. I would just like to say thank you to her for taking her time to share her experience with us. Thank you for PAWI, Pentecostal Assemblies of the West Indies. And this is something that the IGDS is very interested in. Saying as we close, feel free to join the mailing list. If you are another type of organization, a civil society organization, and you want to share your experience with us, please feel free to email us at igds.outreach@sta.uwi.edu. I see it's right there in the chat. And please feel free to join the IGDS mailing list to have access to these presentations. We are going to do some more presentations on this series, because what we're really doing is we're working with the organizations to ensure that they have an advocate in us. And we want to create that space where we can work towards ensuring that this NPO bill works for the wider society. So, Ms. Charles, I thank you so much. I have to thank Ms. Chelsea Sitahal, Catherine Chan, Mercedes Legol, Chanel Glasgow, and I see Deborah Thomas Austin. Thank you so much for being with us today. She's saying thank you, a very informative session. Thanks again, Valerie Charles, for taking the time, and we appreciate you. Everyone, thank you for being with us. This is our second presentation in our NPO series, the NPO Act 2019. And trust me, stay tuned, because we are going to have at least another one, just so that we can get a sense of how we can make our legislation work for us. So this is the IGDS, Deborah McPhee, saying thank you so much and goodbye. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day, everyone. Nice to see you.